Good afternoon, everyone, and on behalf of the L. Douglas Wilder School of Government and Public Affairs at VCU, welcome to the June installment of our Alumni and Lunch and Learn series titled The State House versus the Greenhouse, Reviewing the Landscape of Energy Policy and Climate Action in Virginia, with Dr. Damian Pitt and Dr. Meghan Gough. For those of you joining with us for the first time, the Wilder School hosts a virtual event like this monthly, where we feature change agents, thought leaders, and policymakers who provide insights and commentary on relevant topics of the day. My name is Stephen Dozier. I'm the Director of Development and Alumni Engagement here at the Wilder School. And before we start, I'm going to share a few quick announcements. First, the Wilder School remains at the forefront of our field. It continues to rise in the rankings. U.S. News, World and Report ranks us at number 39, placing us in the top 15% of more than 250 schools across the United States, and top 50 rankings in 4 of our specialty program areas. You can earn a nationally ranked MPA degree in person or online. There's still time to register for classes. The list of available summer courses is posted in the chat. Our fall 2023 application deadline has been extended to July 1 for most graduate programs. So please visit the link or share it with colleagues, friends, or family that might be interested. And last but not least, the spring 2023 Wilder School in Action magazine has arrived. So please browse some of this season's amazing stories. You can use the QR code that's on the screen or the link that's in the chat. And for all of the things that I've mentioned, there are links in the chat for each of those. Please feel free to check that out. And without further ado, I'd like to introduce our moderator, Dr. Meghan Gough, who's Associate Professor here for the Urban and Regional Studies and Planning program. Dr. Gough?
Thank you, Stephen. Well, today I want to welcome everybody, and I have the pleasure of introducing my colleague, Dr. Damian Pitt. Damian Pitt is an Associate Professor of Urban and Regional Studies and Planning in the L. Douglas Wilder School of Government and Public Affairs. He also serves as the Associate Director of Policy and Community Engagement for the newly formed Institute for Sustainable Energy and Environment at VCU. His research focuses on the role of state and local governments in facilitating transfer to clean and renewable energy sources. He has written numerous academic articles and professional reports, including studies for the Virginia Department of Energy, the City of Richmond's Office of Sustainability, and various other solar energy organizations. His most recent research addressed the economic and social equity benefits of low-income energy efficiency funding generated through Virginia's participation in the Regional Greenhouse Gas Initiative, otherwise known and referred to as RGGI. He has served from 2018 to 2022 as a gubernatorial appointee to the Virginia Solar Energy Department and Energy Storage Authority. And last, he in 2015 received a VCU Presidential Quest Fund Award for a project titled Optimizing the Grid Integration of Distributed Solar Energy Through Smart Grid Technology, Power Controls, and Public Policy Initiatives, which he did in collaboration with Dr. Zhifang Wang and others in the VCU Electrical and Computer Engineering Department. So with that, I am thrilled to turn it over to Damian. Damian, you're on mute.
Of course.
Let's start it again.
Okay, thank you. I just want to thank Dr. Gough for the introduction and for getting me unmuted. I want to thank Stephen and everyone else who helped to put this event on. As well as thank Dean Gooden for inviting me to give this presentation. So I am going to start sharing my screen here, and Give me 1 second. We should be good to go. Right. So. Okay, there we go. Okay, thank you very much. So my title is, my presentation is titled "The State House versus the Greenhouse," and I'm going to start with the latter, and then move to the former. So if you permit me, I'm going to start with a little bit of a trip down memory lane to middle school science class, and we're going to talk a little bit about how global warming works and how that creates climate change. Because in my observation, this is something that most people now acknowledge as true, as the scientific consensus, but not a lot of folks really can speak to how this works in basic terms. So we're just going to go through that a little bit first. So if you may recall that the Earth has a naturally occurring layer of gases in the atmosphere, which we call greenhouse gases, carbon dioxide, methane, and others. That function to keep our planet warm by allowing in heat from the sun and then retaining some of that heat as it is radiated back off of the surface of the Earth. So this is what we call the greenhouse effect, and it's not controversial. It's something that I learned about in middle school, and that nobody tends to object to anymore. Nor should there be any debate about the fact that since the Industrial Revolution, humans have been taking carbon out of the Earth's crust in the form of fossil fuels, burning it, converting it to carbon dioxide and other gases, which is then released into the atmosphere, and functions to exacerbate the greenhouse effect. It makes that layer of gases thicker and stronger, so to speak, retains more heat, and that's how we get global warming. And that all is, as I just indicated, a pretty sort of simple, basic middle school level science fact. Where it gets more complicated, and we know this to be true. We have observational data that demonstrates that atmospheric CO2, the level of CO2 in our atmosphere, is increasing at a linear rate, as you see here. We also know for a fact that global average temperatures have been increasing over the last 40 plus years. So this is all true, that humans are causing global warming. Now, as global warming then creates climate change, that's where the science gets far more complicated, but we do have lots of observational data that indicates that is already occurring as well. Just a couple of points that I'll mention here. On the right, you can see how the amount of Arctic sea ice in May of each year is going down at a steady rate over the past 40 plus years. On the left, we see one of the effects, one of the more sort of salient effects of climate change on human populations, which is coastal flooding. And we can see this graph on the left from the EPA, which shows that if you look at the purple bars, those indicate the amount of recurrent of coastal flood events occurring per year from 2010 to 2020. And you can see how those totals are far higher than the totals for any other prior decade. And this is particularly true for the mid-Atlantic measurement locations that I'm showing here, including DC and Sewell's Point, Virginia. So what can we do about this? So this is where my research and advocacy is centered around the transition from fossil fuels to clean energy in order to reduce greenhouse gas emissions, to mitigate the future impacts of climate change, as well as reducing the other air and water pollution impacts that also result from consuming fossil fuels. And in the process, we'll see that there's opportunity for quality of life benefits associated with better technologies, more energy efficient homes, and things of that nature, as well as economic benefits from reducing our energy bills related to the trajectory that they're going under fossil fuel dependency, and achieving broader economic benefits as we invest in these new clean energy technologies and reap the spin-off community economic benefits from that. So the clean energy transition involves the following steps, and this is how I like to articulate it in sort of level of urgency. And the first is to just simply use less energy, right? We need more energy efficient buildings which is around where about 40% of our energy is consumed in residential and commercial buildings. We need to make those buildings more efficient. We need to use more efficient technologies in those buildings in order to reduce our energy consumption. Likewise with transportation, another 40% of our energy use, where we need to figure out ways to make that more efficient and require less energy, particularly less fossil fuels. And that gets to the second point, which is electrify everything. Okay, this may seem a bit counterintuitive, but the only way to get to net zero greenhouse gas emissions is for virtually all of our energy to be consumed in the form of electricity. And that includes, and that means obviously less fossil fuel combustion in vehicles, which is a huge part of that. It also means less direct consumption of natural gas or other fossil fuels for heating in buildings, among other examples, right? And then we need that electricity to be 100% clean and renewable as soon as possible. And things are moving in the right direction as far as that goes. More wind and more solar energy is coming online, but we're still nowhere near where we need to be for 100% clean electricity, as we'll talk about in the next couple of slides. And then there's advanced tech as we upload more and more wind and solar to the grid. There's some advanced technologies like energy storage and others that are going to be necessary to make that really function, to switch from dispatchable fossil fuels to non-dispatchable wind and solar, where Mother Nature decides when that power is working, and we have to have a system that is flexible to accommodate that, which is very much possible, particularly if we adopt the right policy incentives to implement not just the clean electricity generation, but also the storage and other technologies that make that function most effectively. And then finally, we need to consider the social equity impacts of the clean energy transition. And I'll start by saying the least, the worst thing we can do from a social equity standpoint is not transition to clean energy, because that means that we're going to experience the most extreme impacts of climate change in the future. And those impacts will be experienced disproportionately by marginalized populations throughout the world, including Black and brown populations here in America. But as we do transition to clean energy, there are there's potential negative outcomes of that from a social equity perspective that we need to sort of identify on the front end and avoid as we go through this transition. So the status of the clean energy transition now is that we have not made it very far. We are still getting about 80% of our primary energy from fossil fuels. So that's coal, natural gas, and petroleum. So this is for vehicles, obviously, electricity generation, as well as direct heating of homes and industrial applications. The other 20% of our primary energy includes nuclear, hydro, wind, solar, and biomass, some combination of which you could consider clean energy, depending on various definitions thereof. For me, clean energy means wind and solar increasing dramatically the percentage of our energy that comes from those sources, while maintaining for the time being, but not increasing the amount that comes from nuclear and hydroelectricity. So, while wind and solar are still a very small percentage of our energy supply, they are by far the most rapidly growing sources of primary energy, as you can see here, over the past decade plus. The other thing I'll point out on this slide is that on the left-hand side, when you look at the different fossil fuel options, coal is dramatically decreasing as the electricity industry moves away from coal based on both policy drivers as well as just the pure economics of generating electricity. In response, natural gas has increased. And as we see more natural gas systems going online as coal-fired power plants are being shuttered. Another thing I'll mention is I want to touch briefly on sort of the cost and economic implications of this and point out that solar power is already the cheapest source of new electricity generation capacity right now, followed closely by natural gas and wind energy. So those are the three cheapest options currently. The projections from the US Energy Information Administration are that moving forward to 2040, solar and wind will be significantly cheaper than gas or any other source. And it's interesting to note that these analyses from the US EIA don't even look at coal or quote unquote advanced nuclear at all. They're not considered, viable options for future new electricity generation capacity. Another point I'll make briefly around economics is that wind and solar already account for far more jobs than any other individual sector as far as electric power generation goes. 45% of all electric power jobs are in wind and solar now. And as we increase the wind and solar percentages of our portfolio, that job creation benefit is an important sort of side benefit of this. So I'll start talking about policy now, focusing on Virginia. Where things stand now is that after quite a long period of inaction, Virginia, over the course of the 2020 and 2021 General Assembly sessions, really emerged as a leader among U.S. states on clean energy. And that was through the adoption primarily of the three policies you see here. In 2020, we adopted the Virginia Clean Economy Act, which does a lot of things, but I think most notably requires our primary electric utilities, Dominion Power and Appalachian Power, to achieve 100% clean electricity by year 25 for Dominion, 45 for Dominion, 2050 for Appalachian Power. So the second bill here, the Clean Energy and Community Flood Preparedness Act, what the primary thing that did was set in motion the process by which Virginia joined RGGI, the Regional Greenhouse Gas Inventory, which I'll be talking a lot more about in just a moment. And then 2021, we adopted what's called the Clean Car Standard. What that means is that, so every state in the union has the option of following one of two standards for energy efficiency and emission for vehicular emissions. So that's either the federal standard set by the US EPA or the California standard. Okay, so with Virginia now, there are 17 states, if I recall correctly, that follow the California standard. And actually, since Virginia passed this legislation to follow the California standard, both the California and the EPA standards have become much more aggressive in terms of facilitating a conversion to zero emission vehicles. And in fact, under the California standard, which Virginia now follows, there will be no sales of new non-electric vehicles in Virginia or any other state that follows this standard, beginning in 2035. Again, used cars and so forth will still be, lots of fossil fuel vehicles for quite some time, but under the current law, there will be no new sales of internal combustion vehicles after 2035. And I want to stop now and talk about sort of the politics of all this, which are quite salient, and all these bills that you see above were passed on almost entirely party line votes, with some limited exceptions of one vote here or there, and at a time when the Democrats controlled both houses of the General Assembly and the governor's office. Now, obviously, that's changed. Currently, the Youngkin administration is not exactly an enthusiastic supporter of VCEA, but is not exactly trying to undo VCA per se either. They are actively trying to get Virginia out of the RGGI program as well as the Clean Car Standard. And this is a position that is held by the Youngkin administration and most of all Republican members of the General Assembly. And it's consistent with the sort of partisan dynamics of these issues that we see at the federal level and in virtually all states. So I'll talk a little bit more about RGGI now. Again, the Regional Greenhouse Gas Inventory, RGGI for short. So what this is a carbon cap and trade program serving the Northeast regional states all the way down to Virginia, whereby the electric utilities that burn fossil fuels to create electricity have to purchase carbon allowances and have the opportunity to trade those allowances to account for the emissions that they release. So so it serves to reduce greenhouse gas emissions across the region, but also raises revenue that that those states can then use to invest in other types of climate mitigation or adaptation strategies. So in Virginia, we've been participating in this program for 2.5 years. over the course of the 10 quarterly auctions that Virginia's been a part of. We've already raised $660 million, half of which is going to low-income energy efficiency programs that I'll talk more about in a moment. Most of the rest is going to flood mitigation programs. Now, under current law, the electric utilities are allowed to pass those costs off onto consumers at a rate that averages around roughly $2 per month for the average residential customer. And that cost that's being passed forth to customers is a large part of the argument that the Youngkin administration and others have made against RGGI. But while acknowledging that there are those costs, I think it is important to contextualize them, because we actually spend, as residential customers, we spend way more per month on other types of riders and pass-throughs that are specifically tied to our ongoing fossil fuel dependency. And so while the costs of RGGI are true, it's a bit of a red herring to talk about those in a vacuum without acknowledging the costs of fossil fuel dependency that will get worse if we're no longer part of RGGI. So the legal status of this is that Virginia first joined RGGI via executive order in 2017, which at that time Republican-controlled General Assembly was able to basically stymie the actual participation in the program. That was the case until the subsequent legislation that I just mentioned from 2020 and ensuing regulatory processes that established the RGGI program as Virginia as part of today. Now, as many of you know, as this has been fairly big news over the last few weeks, the Youngkin administration is working to repeal the RGGI regulations via the Air Pollution Control Board and its related processes. So just a couple of weeks ago, there was an essentially party line vote whereby the 4 board members appointed by Youngkin all voted to further the process of removing the state from RGGI. The 3 Northam appointees voted against that. It passed. Highly likely that there will be litigation around this issue in the coming months, given that Virginia joined RGGI via legislation. So the legality of exiting RGGI via the regulatory process is, I think, something that is likely to be challenged in the near future. I also want to talk to us about some research on RGGI that I did along with a team of colleagues from the Wilder School as part of my role here with the Institute for Sustainable Energy and Environment. And what we did was focus on the low-income energy efficiency funding. Again, 50% of the total revenue from RGGI goes to low-income energy efficiency. So far, that's already $330 million that have been raised. That revenue on a sort of annual basis is about twice the total of all other sources of low-income energy efficiency funding, right? So if we were to actually leave RGGI and stop collecting that revenue from the auction sales, the amount of money available for low-income energy efficiency would drop by 2/3. Conversely, if we were to stay in RGGI through 2030, the amount of revenue that would be raised would be up to $1.65 billion, which could fund energy efficiency improvements for up to about 130,000 homes. Okay, and that's through a combination of upgrades to existing homes and new multifamily housing that's highly energy efficient that's currently being funded through that program. The result of this is that on average now, customers that are living in those newly energy efficient homes and apartment units are experiencing bill savings on an average of about $540 per year per household. If we stay in the program through 2030, that per year savings will increase, and the total cumulative savings for low-income households we project to be about 70 to 80 million per year. So that's the amount of money that we could potentially stand to lose for low-income energy efficiency if we actually do leave RGGI. Furthermore, the investment of those funds in energy efficiency has spin-off economic benefits, and colleagues of ours here in the Wilder School, former colleagues, did the calculations of the economic impacts of this program, of that revenue, and found that the total cumulative economic impact, including induced and indirect effects, is over $2 billion. Would be over $2 billion, as much as $2.67 billion, were we to stay in the program. And the low-income energy efficiency piece of this is also important because Virginia has high rates of what we call energy burden among our low-income households. So high energy burden is defined as the circumstance in which a household spends 6% or more of their household income on home energy costs. Now that's not gas for your cars. That's home heating, lighting, et cetera, right? So 6% of income is high energy burden, 10% or more is severe energy burden. In Virginia, the average energy burden for non-low income households is about 2%. For low income households, it's 7%, so in that high category. For extremely low income households, it is 17%. So well beyond severe energy burden, getting into what I would characterize as like extreme energy burden. That's the norm for extremely low income households in Virginia. And we'd have no way of knowing exactly how many households are in that severe or extreme energy burden category, but we do know that there are about 154,000 low-income households that exist in census tracts where the average low-income energy burden is in that at least severe, at least 10% category. So that gives some indication of the sort of magnitude of the challenge here. And again, about 100 to 130,000 households could be retrofitted for better energy efficiency via the RGGI funding that we would receive through 2030. This map here from my colleague Ivan Swin is really helpful to illustrate the kind of geographical disparities around energy burden. And what we see here is that the average energy burden of low-income households is well into that severe and extreme percentage for much of rural Virginia, particularly South Side, but lots of other parts of rural Virginia, as you see here. It's and somewhat ironic, given that these are areas that tend to elect Republican General Assembly members, who are the ones that are currently trying to get us out of this program and get us out and walk away from the low-income energy efficiency funding that RGGI is currently providing. So I'm going to take a turn now and talk a little bit about solar energy issues, which is another important part of my research, and obviously very important, and highly controversial political issue in Virginia. The situation here is that utility scale solar farms, that the big generators of solar power for the grid, are booming, right? So we have become in Virginia arguably the leading state of the eastern United States on utility scale solar. And this growth of utility scale solar is supported by Dominion. They're very enthusiastically. Many of those facilities are being built to supply the booming data center industry in Virginia. Some of the other customers of these facilities are institutional customers like universities, the University of Richmond, for example. VCU is not currently a purchaser of solar energy, but perhaps that will change with the new sustainability plan that's being developed now. But the boom of utility scale solar power is raising some questions around land use. It's raising questions about the environmental impacts of utility scale solar, particularly from stormwater runoff. And it's also raising questions about environmental justice, given the sort of trends about where these facilities are being located, which I'll elaborate on in a moment. Now, while we are booming on the utility scale side, Virginia is still far behind on what we call distributed solar. So that's residential rooftop, commercial rooftop, other types of smaller systems. And we have a limited incentive structure for distributed solar here in Virginia compared to other states, even places like North Carolina. And while Dominion is very much supporting utility scale solar, they're still largely resistant to distributed solar, in that distributed solar is customer owned and takes revenue away from the utilities. And there's much more complicated arguments and debates there, but I think it all starts from the fact that distributed solar can be perceived as reducing revenue to the utilities. There's some interesting stuff that we might get to later in the Q&A around what we call shared solar, which is a form of sort of third-party solar ownership that the Youngkin administration actually nominally supports, at least in their energy plan. That support didn't really seem to come around in the last General Assembly session, but perhaps moving forward, there will be opportunities for bipartisan support for legislation to increase community solar and perhaps other types of distributed solar as well. Back to utility scale for a second, I want to highlight some research that was done here in the Wilder School by one of our Masters of Urban Regional Planning students, Aaron Berryhill, who did his final professional plan for the MERP degree as a study for the Virginia Department of Energy. Aaron was subsequently hired by Virginia Energy to continue some of the work on solar issues that came up as a result of this study. So what he did is looked at land use change from where were at the time 38 existing utility scale solar facilities in Virginia. And he did a very important original research to, as you see here on the right, provide a much more nuanced and specific understanding of how land use is being converted from utility scale solar in Virginia. So prior to his study, the only information we had was the permitted area associated with each project, shown in this case in the yellow polygon. Aaron was able to use aerial imagery site plans to hand digitize more accurate mapping, as shown in the red and blue here, to show the actual disturbed area of these sites and actual panel footprints. So we have, as a result of his work, a much better understanding of not only how much land has been converted to utility scale solar, but also what types of land. And on the latter point, what Aaron found is that, I'm sorry, there's a little bit of a glitch here, but the majority of the land that is now utility scale solar had previously been farm or forest land. So cropland is shown in yellow here. Forest land is what's shown in green. That's 56%, I believe. So we know it's mostly been forest land, but what's interesting is that the type of forest land, per Aaron's research, the type of forest land that's been converted is largely a more kind of like moderate value when it comes to conservation benefits, whereas the types of cropland that have been converted are much more higher value in terms of like high value agricultural lands, high quality soils and things of that nature. The other thing that he pointed to was the fact that most of these facilities are in fact being, again, I'm having a technical issue here but there's some additional words here I wanted to show about the fact that I think 60% of utility scale solar facilities are located in census tracts that are above average African-American population in Virginia. So the statewide African-American population is 20%. Most solar facilities utility scale facilities are in census tracts with a higher percentage. And in fact, when you look at the largest facilities, those are mostly concentrated in census tracts that are at least double the African-American population versus the statewide average. So that raises questions about environmental justice. Now, I'm not trying to say that utility scale solar is always necessarily a bad thing for local communities. It certainly does bring in lots of tax revenue and other benefits. But when you look at the loss of farm and forest land and some of the potential impacts to existing agricultural industries in those communities, there are definitely some concerns that need to be fleshed out, and again, potential environmental justice impacts that need to be addressed. Now, having said that, I'm going to wrap up by quickly talking about my role here at this new Institute for Sustainable Energy and Environment at VCU. So this is a new interdisciplinary research center that seeks to pursue innovative scientific, technological, policy, and social justice solutions around climate and clean energy. So a big part of what we're doing is to facilitate interdisciplinary research projects, creating new research teams, providing them seed funding, sending them on their way to hopefully go out and get additional grant money to continue that research. Some of that has included developing new research on within the realm of policy, humanities, and social sciences. So we partnered with a group called the Humanities Research Center to do this research incubator, where we brought folks together to through a consensus-based process to identify research teams and distribute a portion of the Institute's funding to create new teams. Dr. Gough, our host here today, as well as another Wilder School colleague, Shruti Sial, are both leads on teams that emerge from this process and receive some of the Institute's funding. In terms of policy and community engagement, my role at the Institute, we also have an internship program where we placed multiple students at government and nonprofit agencies. Several of those students were hired via a process that prioritizes diversity, equity, inclusion, and they're working, and many of them working on environmental justice issues at their placement agencies. We're also conducting a variety of education and outreach events to spread the word and provide education and information around climate and clean energy to the broader community. So that's all I have. Appreciate everyone's time here today, and I'm happy to start answering questions.
Thank you so much, Damian. You packed a lot into a short time period, so good job with that. I have a couple questions to get us started, but I do want to encourage others to keep adding their questions to the chat or the Q&A, and I will work those into our conversation. But Damian, I wanted to start off, you've shared a number of ways that data can be used and is being used to inform effective policies and the possibilities of it. What do you see as the highest priority or the biggest obstacle for Virginia to remain a national model for sustainability leadership?
Yeah, thank you. Well, I mean, to be frank, the biggest obstacle is still the sort of partisan political nature of these issues. So finding some way to resolve that and the results in us, retaining our existing policies around RGGI, BCA, and clean cars. I mean, I think that's really, the biggest priority. The biggest obstacle, I would say, is actually kind of unrelated to what I've been talking about today, but it's actually the transportation piece. So transportation is 40% of our greenhouse gas emissions. The portion that comes from electricity is one that we have a vision. We have currently in Virginia, the policies in place to achieve that vision. We know what the technology is and what we need to do to achieve 100% clean electricity. But when it comes to the transportation emissions, we do have the clean car standard, but that alone is not going to get us where we need to go. We're not reducing transportation emissions at nearly the rate we need to achieve global climate mitigation objectives. And that's where our field, Dr. Gough of Urban and Regional Planning, really comes in, where we need to figure out ways through land use and transportation infrastructure to reduce our dependency on automobiles, get more folks moving around via active and sustainable modes. And when we are in automobiles, make sure that those are zero energy vehicles. So I would say that transportation piece is really the biggest technical obstacle and the part that we've made the least progress on thus far.
Thank you. Well, that's a challenge to transportation folks who are on the line right now.
Yeah.
I also wanted to ask about, so part of your talk was really thinking about the equity piece of these tools, these policies, and so on. And so, as you stated, we know that historically the benefits of energy research and policies have often not reached Black, Brown, Indigenous, low-income communities. And these are specifically, as you said, the communities that have higher rates of pollution, health impacts, higher energy burdens. So, in comparison to white and higher income communities. So I wanted to see if you could tell us a little bit more about that. I want to dig into that a little bit more about kind of what are the approaches for advancing this equity-focused clean energy? Who's doing it? How are they engaging with underserved communities?
Yeah, sure. Well, first of all, I want to kind of reframe it or push back a little bit because anything. As we know, the impacts of environmental pollution and degradation are always felt disproportionately by marginalized populations, right? So anything we do at the macro level to reduce greenhouse gas emissions and other forms of pollution, I think are going to benefit those communities. But I think what you're getting at is the concern that in the process of transitioning to clean energy, we will create other obstacles that are going to continue to leave marginalized communities behind. And I think that there's definitely some concerns around that. There's a lot of research on the concept of the just transition. I point you to Dr. Sonia Cargley, who I think is a real leader on this issue. up until recently at Indiana University. She's now at Penn, and she does a lot of research on identifying what those potential what the potential inequities could be down the road as we pursue this clean energy transition. And a lot of that's around economics, right? So as we transition to electric vehicles, rooftop solar, energy efficiency, and so forth, the current incentive structure for that is largely around tax credits that and through the recent Inflation Reduction Act at the federal level, we have a very robust suite of those tax credits for consumers. And but even with those tax credits, it's not going to be enough to really make investment in these advanced technologies feasible for low-income populations in the short term. So addressing that, fixing that in a better way to kind of level the playing field when it comes to adoption of these technologies, I think is important. The Inflation Reduction Act does, for example, have income restrictions on receiving the tax credits. It does have, on the production side, there are tax credit bonuses for investments in clean energy in marginalized and low-income communities. So there's a bit of a framework there, but there needs to be more direct action to really facilitate the uptake of clean energy technology, particularly in the residential sector for low-income communities. Now, I'd say the most fundamental important piece of this is low-income energy efficiency. So bringing it back to Reggie, as far as Virginia goes, at the federal level, we have a longstanding program called the Weatherization Assistance Program that upgrades homes for very low-income households. Through the recent bipartisan infrastructure law, there's been a big boom. There's been a big increase in funding for that program, but it's a short-term measure, and there's not, we need a better long-term solution to really fundamentally invest in energy efficiency for our low-income households as a key step in the just transition. One other thing I'll quickly mention is that we in Virginia have this community solar program that, long story short, was adopted by the General Assembly and subsequently kind of like undermined via the regulatory process that created the rules for implementation. And but what emerged out of that is that we do still have a program for low-income community solar. So this is a program that is starting to take effect, particularly in Southwest Virginia, through a group called Community Housing Partners, and they are working with solar providers to put solar panels on low-income apartment buildings and so forth via this community solar program, and helping to reduce energy bills for those households in the process. So expanding that program is another way we can achieve that just transition.
Thank you. I'm going to move to, we have a growing number of questions. I'm going to move to some of the questions that are coming in. And one of them is focusing on that transportation question. And it says, in terms of adoption of EVs, electric vehicles and infrastructure to support critical mass in EVs adoption, are there other technologies that you see that can be adopted in parallel with EVs, like biofuels, hydrogen, whatever?
I think there's a role for biofuels in some applications, particularly in more like heavy-duty vehicles, and that's something that's already happening in a lot of places. Hydrogen is something that I'm pretty skeptical about in general. I think there are some potential applications. There's a role for hydrogen in the clean energy transition, but I would characterize it as being sort of on the margins. And I don't really see hydrogen vehicles as something that we should be investing a lot of time and energy in. Now, perhaps aviation down the road, I think that, but not in terms of like regular passenger vehicles. But what is needed to sort of complement and facilitate the EV transition is of course better EV infrastructure, but also a policy framework around incentivizing vehicle to grid. So having EVs being a functional part of our electricity grid, not just that, and functioning as a form of like short-term energy storage. Like right now, people typically plug in their EVs at night, and they use electricity that's obviously not being generated by solar power. And sort of in parallel, we have this kind of concern that if we build too much solar power, that's going to create problems for the grid. So the solution for that is to charge in your EVs at the daytime using solar power, and we need both the infrastructure and sort of the rate structure incentives to make that possible.
Okay, so there are several questions coming in around the equity piece of this research, and I'll pick one of them. This one said, Reggie allocated funds to both low-income energy efficiency programs and flood protection. Were these funds allocated to specific low-income energy efficient programs run by localities, or how was this money distributed? So kind of questions about engagement and decision-making.
Yeah, great question. So, and I'm glad to have the opportunity to talk about this. The money is run through DHCD, the Department of Housing Community Development, and the decision was made to kind of like expedite the expenditure of those funds by sort of channeling them through existing programs. So there's two primary ways. First, I mentioned earlier the Federal Weatherization Assistance Program. That provides upgrades to, provides federal money for upgrades to very low-income households. Apparently, prior to Reggie, there was a problem where many of the households that were seeking that federal weatherization funding were being rejected because the conditions of the house were so poor that it was deemed kind of like unworthy of weatherization. And so a portion of the Reggie money for low-income energy efficiency is going to something called the Weatherization Deferral Repair Program. So that is money that is sort of like pre-upgrading homes to get them qualified to receive the federal money to then become further weatherized and energy efficient. So that's one portion of the money. The rest of the other portion, which is I think turning into the bulk of the money, is that it's going into an existing pot of money for the Affordable Special Needs Housing Program, which is a program that pulls money from a variety of sources via DHCD to then work with low-income housing providers to build low-income housing. And there's already a requirement in place that any low-income housing built through DHCD has to reach a certain level of energy efficiency. But now with the Reggie funding, that's being sort of augmented on to require even further energy efficiency, like borderline net zero type, highly energy efficient units that are being either built new or retrofitted via sort of the kind of existing ongoing low-income housing market.
Okay, so we have a question looking at utility scale solar farms. So the question is, some issues that have been rising from utility scale solar farms is agriculture and the Title VI EJ issues. Communities that are high EJ, I'm assuming environmental justice, and impacted see burdens from the environmental impacts of these solar farms, with some issues of access to food, health, education, and transportation. Do you see these utility solar farms growing more? And do you see them growing especially in rural areas?
Well, definitely see them growing more, and definitely in rural areas. The question now, so far, again, it's a lot of it's been in communities with a higher African American percentage in Virginia. I don't know that necessarily would continue. I mean, probably, unless there's policies in place to kind of mitigate that. But I think the real, what's really needed is policies to incentivize and direct the utility scale solar towards more marginalized landscapes, right? So, and rather than it being greenfield projects where you're cutting down trees or taking agricultural land out of production, looking for, previously degraded lands, looking for, there's a huge opportunity on former mountaintop removal mining sites in Southwest Virginia. So Virginia and Department of Energy is trying to figure out ways to sort of direct more utility scale solar to those types of facilities. So yeah, I think that, there's a clear need and opportunity for getting those facilities off of farmland and onto other types of land where the impact is less severe. And in terms of like the impact on marginalized communities, from what I understand, it is a large part of the concern is about the impact on the agricultural industries, right? So if a landholding farmer chooses to put to lease their land for utility scale solar, that's their choice and that's their right. But if that's taking land out of agricultural production, that does have spin-off economic impacts on agricultural industries throughout the community. And so I think that's a big part of the concern there.
So we have a couple of questions that are kind of bringing your research back to the institution. So we have a question about the ISEE. I'm curious about how an organization like ISEE thinks about engagement with the private sector and civil society, in addition to traditional policy advocacy. How can organizations like this engage with people whose work may not seem to relate directly to the transition to clean energy, like small business owners, people in the nonprofit sector, other educators, and so on?
Yeah, well, I think we're doing quite a bit so far to engage with the nonprofit sector, community activists around these issues, not necessarily the small businesses per se. So that's one piece of it. And then there's certainly also, what the Institute does, there's kind of two different wings to the Institute. We have science and technology researchers who are developing really new, interesting new collaborations across engineering and physics and chemistry and things like that. And they all have partnerships with industry, right? And that I think is always going to be the case. And we're hoping to kind of increase partnerships with clean energy industries and sustainable industries, right? On the policy and community engagement side, and that we have the research that we're doing, some of which, and in particular, Meghan, are doing community engaged research projects that are working with the community around adapting to the impacts of climate change and other types of sort of sustainability issues that are broadly energy and climate related. And we're also, as I kind of already mentioned, working a lot with the advocacy community, the nonprofits that are the folks who are really having most essential to facilitating policy change at the state level, are folks at Chesapeake Climate Action Network, Virginia Conservation Network, groups like that. And through this institute, we're really trying to kind of formalize some of the relationships with those groups.
And, as we might have time for one more question after this, but kind of sticking with this connection back to VCU, there were a couple questions about ways that VCU and maybe specifically the Wilder School could play a role in supporting these discussions with lawmakers, especially, there are questions around how to navigate kind of the politics around this topic, and how some of the arguments can be better understood, maybe among legislators who are opposing or Reggie on different grounds. So I wonder if there's a way that a position that you see the Wilder School taking to help lead in some of these discussions more broadly.
Yeah, well, I mean, we have already our sort of Office of Public Policy Outreach and some of the programs that they have that we have here that are effective at sort of providing information to legislators. And I think we've done some of that, and I've had a good relationship with that office over the years on to work on energy and environmental issues. But yeah, in terms of like addressing the partisan divide, there's plenty of logical reasons why conservatives could, the classic sort of definition of conservatism is not, in my opinion, inconsistent with the idea of protecting the environment for future generations, and particularly when you look at sort of the economic consequences of not doing that. And there are groups like Conservatives for Clean Energy that are trying to sort of address that partisan divide and get legislators more on board with the clean energy transition. And so perhaps there is a role. I don't think I'd be the most effective communicator for this, but I think there could be a role for VCU and the Wilder School in helping to articulate that message as to how clean energy can be consistent with conservative values as well. And a big part of that is around distributed solar, right? So the whole concept of putting a roof, and there is a strong grassroots movement around, not to be too stereotypical, but like rural conservative people who are kind of, who value their independence and don't want to be dependent upon some like mega corporation that's based in Richmond to provide their energy. They want to be able to provide their own energy. And there's definitely a constituency that's been effectively, activated in other states, particularly Florida, to push back, to like engage rural conservatives to push back against state policies that are anti-distributed solar. So that's a particular avenue that I find frustrating that we haven't really been able to achieve that yet in Virginia.
Okay, well, I want to go ahead and close this out so we have time to make some final points from the Wilder School, but I want to thank Dr. Damian Pitt for sharing his expertise with us today. I see it's evident from this talk that in the discussion that came out of it that the energy burden program in Virginia has important economic impacts for households throughout the state. Dr. Pitt's provided us with a lot of thinking on the tools, the research, the policy that, if implemented, can support Virginia in being, I guess, once again, a strong leader in clean energy policy. So thank you so much, Damian. And Stephen, I'm going to hand it over to you.
Thank you, Dr. Gough and Dr. Pitt. I wanted to share more links to your work, Dr. Pitt, and the work of VCU in that area. And so I popped those into the chat. Everyone, please take the time to check that out. Again, thank you to our moderator, to our speaker for a great session today. Thank you all for joining us for lunch, if you're eating lunch, and if not, thank you for joining us in the middle of the day. We are looking forward to our July 26th installment, which is Virginia Higher Education, what comes next, with Peter Blake, who's the director of the State Council of Higher Education. Excuse me. Thank you, everyone. Apologies. Thank you, everyone, for joining us today. And thank you to our communications team. I hope you all have a great day.